Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. I just want to start this video by saying this is going to be slightly a different format than most of my other videos. Today is going to be more of a podcast where I'm just going to get into a deep discussion about a specific topic. Now, I will include what I consider to be relevant images. However, the topic I'm discussing is really so ancient that we don't have any modern day photographs to really do this topic justice. But without further ado, let's get right into it. After a very successful last few videos focusing on St. Louis and the 1904 World's Fair, I'd like to roll the timeline back quite a bit, which is something we don't often do on my channel. Today we're going to be talking about the ancient siege machines. If you're unfamiliar or need a brief refresher on siege machinery and what the narrative says it was created and used for, I will dive into that briefly before sharing what I would consider to be the most important siege machine of all time. Now, siege machinery, also known as siege engines, are essentially any device that is used to break through massive fortifications to penetrate into enemy territory, such as a castle or a fortified star city. These types of machines date back to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, roughly 2000 BC. Siege machines can range in size from a small hut all the way up to a massive structure or tower. Siege machines throughout time were built in place, as well as the more popular and fascinating wheeled siege machines, which would be transported and then used in battle. What I find really interesting is we have this unique nature of siege weaponry. We're told, according to the current narrative, that this specific type of weapon was used to penetrate fortresses for over 3,000 years. When we consider the timeline that we're currently presented with, it really is remarkable to consider just how long castles and massive stone fortifications have been in use. For siege weaponry to be one of the main aspects of nearly all major armies throughout nearly all ancient history would imply, at least to me, that nearly every city that was written about in the context of a historical battle was most likely a fortified city. Whether these fortifications were star forts exactly or other, what some would call simpler castle-like structures, the main idea here being there was at least a fortified stone structure that needed to be penetrated in nearly every single one of these battles. It was always some sort of fortified castle. And you look through history from 2000 BC onward through even the early Middle Ages, and we have siege weapons being used throughout this time period. So just imagine all of the castles, all of the fortifications, everything that we really don't know about. Because when I read about ancient history, a lot of times we have lost cities. We have cities like Troy, for example, that don't really have any remains besides what is buried underground and what has been excavated. But at one time, the city of Troy was one of the most sprawling fortified cities in the entire world until it fell. And it's remarkable to me that we have these cities that basically we're told were lost to time. And you wonder how they fell. You wonder how a city so large, so fortified, all these castles, all these towers, how could it fall? Siege weaponry. At least that's what we're told in the narrative. So that's why I felt like today it would be important to dive into this history just a little bit. If we look at this from a different perspective, we can identify that siege machines were being used to destroy the oldest of the old world cities as far back as 2000 BC, but essentially even up until 1000 AD. We have this siege weapon that is crucial in the destruction of star cities, fortified castles, and all of these historic places that those who took them over would basically then rewrite the history. But first, they would use their siege weaponry to destroy the castle that was there. Throughout time, we have a lot of writings, especially when we look into the ancient and most important castles. And within these writings, we are told at different times the castle fell. The castle was then rebuilt. This history repeats itself throughout the narrative multiple times. And I always wondered, how did these castles fall? Sometimes we imagine that maybe the castle didn't fall. Maybe it was just inherited from one group to the next group, and they claimed it as their own. They claimed that they had built it, that they had rebuilt it, and things along those lines. But if we look at the narrative from a slightly different perspective, we can see that the siege machine would basically be an old world demolition machine. If we take the context of war out of this and we say an army or a new group, a new society had come to claim an area. Let's take the war out of it. Let's say they just took over the area. Now, let's say that they wanted to change the history of that area. The first thing that they would do would be to destroy the massive buildings that represented the people in which they conquered. So this is where we have siege machines. We are told they were only used in battles and in times of war, but one can imagine that these machines may have actually been used as ancient demolition machines, machines that were used to reshape history. These machines would contain absolutely brutal weaponry, from catapults, which launch boulders the size of humans, to an ancient form of the crossbow, or ballista, which took 4 men to fire and included nearly 8-foot-long arrows or javelins. One of the main and forgotten features of these machines are the assortment of battering rams, which often adorned the front of the device. While many siege machines were very tall and could be used to have the higher ground over the enemy, lots of the most famous siege machines also contained absolutely massive battering rams, which would be used to crumble enemy walls. The sheer size of these devices alone is also often forgotten. More famous of these devices have been recorded as weighing hundreds of tons, standing over 100 feet tall and containing multiple stories of ancient projectile weaponry. These massive machines not only allowed the soldiers to have their own mobile fortification, but the construction of these siege engines is also absolutely fascinating. The engineering alone that would have to go into the creation of a device like this is really hard to fathom. To imagine ancient armies throughout the world hauling a device like this, or even creating one on the spot at the battle site, seems like quite a feat and accomplishment. In modern day warfare, we see the coordinated construction of different weapons on the fly, but to construct a massive tower over 100 feet tall with its own fortifications and multiple stories of internal weaponry over 2,000 years ago is absolutely telling to how intelligent and capable ancient society really was. We often discuss inherited things, inherited buildings, inherited tech, inherited people. But what I find interesting is how history seems to often repeat itself as well. In the 1800s, we can see a changing of the guard, so to speak. Many old world buildings and cities were reshaped during this time period. The oldest and most unique fortifications seem to be either repurposed or simply destroyed. Sometimes we are told this is due to disasters like fires or floods, but most of the time we are simply told the old world structures did not fit the new regime or the new plan. The modern history books are careful not to mention the reason for hiding the grandest structures, meaning less questions will be asked and less history will be re-examined if these structures simply disappeared or changed significantly. What if the ancient buildings built with this sacred geometry, it appears, and the star forts, and this whole unified culture throughout the world that we always want to dream of and discuss, what if it existed far before the 1800s? What if the ancient battles and the struggles, and even the likes of Genghis Khan's conquering of the modern world, all had something to do with erasing the ancient cities of stars? I'm not telling you what to believe or think, but I do want to pose a couple questions. Like, what if the star forts or the fortifications, the fortified cities, the castles, have an age that compares to creation itself? What if they were the reason for being? What if they came to be as humanity came to be? The first hand, so to speak, that God ever reached out to us. This is just a food for thought idea, but an interesting one nonetheless, because we have the idea that for thousands of years, all around the world, these castles and star cities had already existed. They were already built. Even 3,000 years ago, there was enough of them that existed that these siege weapons had to be created in the sense that we must destroy or be able to penetrate these massive star fortifications. So just imagine what the people back then had to be building like, what the architecture had to be like all around the world to have these giant fortifications that are still in modern times being excavated, meaning they haven't fully crumbled. They're basically still underground, still fully intact for the most part. And we see this all around the world, these massive fortifications. To imagine the very first men, the very first people of what some would say intelligence, some of the first things that they were able to do was build massive fortified cities. It's just really hard to imagine in the timeline that we're given and in the narrative we're given, with all the developments that we have being said to come at much later times. And then we look back at ancient history and we have cities that are so big and so fortified, and people that want to get into them, or enemies of these cities, of these areas, enemies against what they represented, were unable to get into them. So they created massive siege weapons to topple these buildings. And it's just such an interesting narrative. We can look at it from so many different angles, but I'd love to hear your opinion on it. Look at the city that you live in currently. Now consider the architecture in your city right now. Are there buildings over 100 years old? How about the modern construction of your city or town? Would you consider that in 1,000 years' time, the people of your town would still be constructing the exact same type of building? How about 2,000 years from now? Is there any part of you that sees 2,000 years from now in your town that the buildings would be built in exactly the same way that they are today? That's where we get the idea of this phantom timeline. And I think when we consider what we are told about forts and fortifications and even war and battle, that it certainly adds to this debate. Meaning, if we really want to believe that society and humanity had this 3,000 year period where essentially nothing advanced. I mean, we have a ton of little advancements that when you actually dive into it, we can find them pointed out in the narrative. But if you look at the overarching tale that we've been presented with in school and everything else, we have the idea that these fortifications, these castles, these star cities, all of this stuff was happening 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and we were still building like that if we had the ability to up until the Middle Ages. So really interesting. We have the whole Renaissance time period, and you wonder what exactly that means. Again, it leads back to how much does history repeat itself? How much of the timeline was really fabricated, and how much do we know about the creation and destruction of the massive fortified cities of our past and of current times? Because many cities that are of the utmost history and have the most to do with, the old world, we would say, especially the cities of Europe, and even some of the oldest cities in Asia have a lot of this history that seems to predate what the current narrative has told us. And we see these fortifications, and we see basically the foundation of these major cities being from vastly ancient times. So you have to wonder what really was going on back then. And the siege weapon, I believe, is almost like a clue into the idea that even back then we were committing these different sorts of resets and basically rewriting the history and changing it to fit what we wanted to present. At least that's what I take away when I read this narrative. I'd like to hear your opinion though down below. Now, for the remainder of this video, and what led me to want to create this video, is the remarkable story of the siege tower of Helopolis. Now, I tried to find the proper pronunciation, and different Greek forums had different pronunciations. I'm going with Helopolis because it's the easiest for me to say, although modern Greek will tell us that the H is silent. Anyway, this siege tower is absolutely massive. Helopolis is implied in its brief narrative to be more than one tower, or the whole idea of being multiple Helopolis towers were created in ancient Greece. Helopolis is said to mean taker of cities, and when you see depictions of it, you'll certainly understand why. Now, the Helopolis was designed by Polydius of Thessaly, with no exact date of construction given, but the tower was said to be used throughout ancient Greece up until around the siege of Rhodes in 305 BC. The Helopolis was ridiculously large, said to stand 130 feet tall, 65 feet wide, and weighing over 160 tons. I'm honestly not a construction worker, foreman, or mathematician, but I cannot seem to figure out the formula here and the manpower that it would take to haul a 160-ton tower, even on wheels. It appears really mind-boggling to me. Now, to imagine that this device, the Helopolis, is also said to have been taken to battle sites by boat is also quite ridiculous as well. Is it possible to build a device over 2,000 years ago that could float in the ocean and hold 160 tons? Because that's what we're told was happening, and I just think that's really fascinating. Now, the machine is said to have been powered by a massive capstan driving the set of 8 15-foot tall wheels. I didn't realize a while ago in making old videos how important the capstan is and how much it represents of the old world. I've depicted it just by chance in many other old world videos, and it seems to be a really essential device throughout time, and one like the siege weapons that has seemed to lasted and become a symbol of the old world. Now, the Helopolis was said to be fireproof due to being completely lined in massive iron plates on the exterior. Can you imagine the process of creating every single iron plate and then attaching it to the Helopolis? To apply these iron plates, each one was roughly the size of 2 men over the entirety of a 130-foot tall by 65-foot wide tower is breathtaking to talk about. Now, besides the iron facade, we also have a really fascinating design on the interior. This device, this siege machine, Helopolis, was walled on 3 sides, and the open side allowed soldiers to use massive internal staircases which ran the entire height of this tower. A second staircase stood close by. One of the staircases was used for ascending the tower, and the other was used for descending. Now, this tower basically resembled a step pyramid design, with the largest level on the bottom, and each subsequent level going up was smaller than the one before it. The Helopolis had iron-plated windows, or apertures, behind which contained projectile weaponry. On the lowest level lied the largest catapults, which were 2 180-pounders and also 160-pounder. Now, when I say that, the pound is the weight of the projectile which this catapult would launch. And interestingly, if you look at the design of these catapults, they appear much like massive crossbows or ballistas. They're very interesting. However, in this old ancient Greek, they are referred to as catapults. Now, the second level contained 3 more 60-pound catapults. The narrative continues by telling us that Helopolis contained 5 more additional levels that contained 2 30-pound catapults each, as well as a final 2 levels on the top, which contained what they call dart throwers. These darts are basically javelins, or what some would consider to be massive arrows. However, they could be up to 8 feet long, and the device that launched them, it was sometimes just the soldiers themselves using their arms, their hands, to rain down upon the enemy fortified castle, but they also had parts of this device, these javelin throwers, that were actually machine operated. They were basically ancient massive crossbows, and it's absolutely ridiculous to imagine all of the damage that this siege tower would inflict. Now, from these top 2 levels, basically, we're told that soldiers would also be able to cast down ladders and the such to enter into the enemy fortified area. So essentially, Helopolis is the siege machine to own all siege machines, and the fact that it existed at all, and possibly even more than one existed, over 2,000 years ago, leaves me with a lot more questions than answers, and also a couple of interesting theories. Now, most of the time, I don't present history this old simply because we rarely have enough verifiable sources, and we don't have any photographs. While I love ancient history, it's hard to quantify its importance without being able to see how it affected modern society and to see depictions of it. In this case, however, I do believe siege weapons were used for what they are said to be used for, meaning I believe they were used to destroy old world castles, old world star cities, and the old world narrative. While I may disagree to the nature exactly of how they were employed in battle, it does make sense to me that a device was created to tear down ancient castles by those who were gaining power. In this case, we are told it was first the ancient Egyptians, then the ancient Greeks, so on and so forth. But essentially, whoever has the most power has the most siege weapons, and it seems to be a correlation that we see throughout time. Now, much in the same light, these machines basically cleared the landscape for a new history to arise. Helopolis is, I believe, the most important siege tower, not only because all the depictions that we see of it and the age given of it, but also the amazing details that the narrative presents about it. We have an interesting fate for the Helopolis tower, to say the least. Now, diving back into this narrative, we have the city of Rhodes, and Rhodes was a fortified star city built on an island and was one of the largest and most important cities in the ancient kingdom of Alexander the Great, who is said to have conquered Rhodes from the Persians, although the Persians are not the original inhabitants. Now, Rhodes worshipped the sun god Helios and had some of the highest fortified walls surrounding a fort in all of Alexander's empire. Upon Alexander's death, basically 3 of his generals became embroiled in a dispute over his kingdom. Eventually, Rhodes aligned with Ptolemaic Egypt. Now, to make this long story short, we're told that Demetrius, who was the son of another one of Alexander's generals, was sent to besiege Rhodes in hopes of deterring it from staying in an alliance with Egypt. So, we have Demetrius basically heading off to Rhodes to destroy the city. While not a lot of details are given about this, we are told that Demetrius constructed a 180-foot long battering ram and the 130-foot tall, 360,000-pound Helopolis tower. Now, there are alternating stories that exist about exactly what happened, but either way, in a nutshell, we are told that Demetrius lost. We are told that Rhodes stood strong, and the Helopolis, possibly more than one of them, was left behind in the area of Rhodes. Now, the version of this narrative that I like to believe comes to us from none other than Vitruvius. Now, a side note here, and I say it every time I mention his name, but if you're unfamiliar with Vitruvius, I beg you to do a little bit of research on this man. His teachings, for the most part, seem to nearly shape everything we understand about architecture today. He is one of the big holes in the narrative, one of the aspects of the Phantom or Lost 1,000 Years that I like to talk about, because in nearly every ancient old world depiction of what we know about architecture, It is said to have come from Vitruvius's work on architecture that was lost for a period of nearly 1,000 years until being quote-unquote rediscovered in the late 1300s and early 1400s. Now that is all set up, Vitruvius wrote extensively on the Helopolis, having visited Rhodes many times in his lifetime. Rhodes was losing the battle on the verge of destruction to the Helopolis when somehow a soldier of Rhodes was able to knock off some iron plates near the base of Helopolis. Fearing that the Helopolis would be set ablaze, it was pulled out of battle by Demetrius, only to be left behind when his soldiers retreated. However, in Vitruvius's version, Vitruvius writes that the soldiers of Rhodes actually set a trap for the massive machine Helopolis. It is written by Vitruvius that upon seeing the enemy soldiers arriving and upon Rhodes being surrounded, the citizens of Rhodes, and some of them soldiers, are said to have dug a hole under the fortifications of the city in the middle of the night, towards the area where the enemy troops had been moving the Helopolis into position. Through this hole, Vitruvius writes, the citizens of Rhodes rerouted as much of their sewer and water systems as they could, flooding the area on which the Helopolis was to stand by daybreak. Upon trying to move the Helopolis into position the next morning, Demetrius found that the massive machine became stuck, trapped in the mud that was created by the citizens of Rhodes. Without the essential machine for destruction, Demetrius and his soldiers retreated, leaving behind the massive Helopolis amongst the other relics of war. Either way, as all good stories go, we're told that Helopolis was then dismantled by the people of Rhodes. The iron and other metals were melted down, and the spoils of war were sold off to create the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And that's how we come full circle in this narrative. Essentially, as a little kid, I really loved the Bible stories. I think that's why I'm so particularly interested in the Old World today. I love these stories which incorporated the Old World and parts of the Bible, and I always felt like I knew, even as a 5-year-old, that the stories of ancient Greece and the Greek gods were somehow intertwined with the stories of the Bible. To me as a youngster, these stories appeared to be much like one and the same, chapters from the same grand storybook of creation itself. I didn't exactly differentiate one god to the next, nor did I feel dumb for thinking maybe these stories were discussing the same God, the same people, the same struggles. I was always obsessed when the 7 wonders of the ancient world were talked about, and I read about them in vast detail. The pyramids always seemed to bore me, and when compared to the no longer existing wonders, the pyramids seemed to be lackluster. Maybe as a kid that was because they were still existing and the other ones were lost to time, but I had no idea about the possibility of ancient power sources or stolen histories or anything like that. I just knew I wanted to know more about the Colossus of Rhodes specifically, and that was by far the most interesting of the 7 wonders to me. Now, in all my childhood wonderment, I never once remember reading that the Colossus of Rhodes was built by and from the melted down metals of this massive Helopolis war machine. Heck, I'd even seen siege towers depicted before, even as a kid, but I never thought with such audacity and lavish details one would be constructed that was basically meant to destroy the city of Rhodes. It's just fascinating to me. Call it being born way back in the 90s, but how much of this history that has seemed to be reshaped even in the last 20 years or so. We have these massive machines, siege machines, and more specifically siege towers like the Helopolis being used to basically infiltrate and obliterate the oldest of old world cities. We see images of old cities in the 1800s after fires and other disasters, and it looks to me a lot like what Helopolis was said to be doing to these cities. Buildings cut at impossible angles, and then they say it's done by fire. There's trees that are left unaffected, but the masonry buildings are burnt. There's rubble and there's ruins everywhere, but many times the loss of life is minimal almost like someone warned these people in these cities that they were about to be destroyed, only to march in with some sort of siege tower or other weapon that would reshape the landscape. Now, we don't have anything to base this off of besides the ideas of the ancient past, of these war machines, of these siege machines like Helopolis. It's just an example of a possibility I wanted to present. I'm not going to dive into this too much further, but in conclusion, I just wanted to reflect on the idea of a siege machine, a massive tower on wheels which one could take or use to destroy a city at will. Imagine using this same type of weapon for thousands of years, and it is said to have been used by thousands of different armies. One can only imagine the thousands upon thousands of cities that must have been left in the wake of these types of machines. And these cities are ones that we probably can't even fathom today. All we really see are the ancient ruins. So I just wanted to present that with you. Basically, these siege machines were old world destruction machines. They were old world machines used to tear down massive castles and towers and to, quote, besiege them for new ownership.